You've read the title, you know what this video is about. By the way, I have a bit of a lisp and I have a strange accent, but anyway, let's get into Katara's romantic journey in the first season of Avatar: The Last Airbender. The Southern Water tribe, at least in the original show, is absolutely ransacked. Honestly, it's just a bunch of tents surrounded by a snow wall. It's a genuine compliment to call it a village because it's honestly just a camp. Anyhow, I want to focus on the younger dynamic of the village. So what kind of young people do we see in it? Well, of course there's Katara and Sokka, and then there's the little babies that the women of the village had around the time their husbands left, and up to 9 months after that, of course. But besides that, there's nobody else, and what I want to focus on specifically is that there are no boys. Of course, except Sokka, but Sokka doesn't really count. What I'm talking about is Katara's romantic, I suppose, perspective. You could say she's not really into romance, and you'd be right, of course. She isn't really into romance in the beginning, in the middle, and in the end. She says as much to Aang in season 3. With the exception of Jet, of course, and I suppose Aang in the finale. But from a psychological perspective, what does it mean to be a girl that grows up in this village that she's practically carrying on her back along with her grandmother, because her grandmother is the village elder at that point? How does it feel to be growing up in this scenario with no peers of the opposite gender, or at least peers that you might be attracted to, not necessarily of the opposite gender? I think this is where Katara's aversion to romance stems from. Before you call me out saying, oh, she fell in love with Jet, I'm gonna get to Jet, okay? I'm gonna get to him. But it's safe to say that throughout the first 14 years of her life, she was given no opportunity to delve into her romantic side. As a matter of fact, she was forced into the role of a mother. I imagine to all of the little kids in the tribe, but also to Sokka, even though he is her older brother and she is his younger sister. In a way, we have her skipping the dating part and going straight to the family part. This reminds me personally of a book called The Handmaid's Tale. So basically there's like a divide between women in this book. Some women are meant to be mothers and others are meant to be childbearers. These are two distinct roles and there's some tension between them. In other words, sexuality and motherhood are separated. And I think this is especially interesting when it comes to Atla, because Katara's biggest ships are Kataang and Zutara. Kataang kind of symbolizes, or I suppose brings out Katara's motherly side, and Zutara, at least in the fanfics, emphasizes Katara's more sexual side, romantic side. And we can talk about whether Katara's character was actually meant to be sexualized and meant to be put in these very frisky situations, but I mean, everybody has a different perspective on this, and I don't think there's any merit in arguing about this, because at the end of the day, everybody perceives the characters differently, and it's kinda difficult to enforce what people fantasize about. But back on track, we see that Katara is very mature as a mother, but her romantic side remains completely neglected up until she meets Jet. Just a quick note, I don't think Haru and Katara had any romance. I think they bonded very beautifully on a personal level, but I don't read any romance in their episode, I'm sorry. So now we finally get to Jet, and there's a few things I'd like to say about him. Firstly, according to the Avatar extras, Katara actually had her first kiss with him. And I want you to think about how important that was for her, this ginormous moment in her life, the first kiss, and the fact that the show creators decide to skip it. Katara is a main character in this show and the romantic interest of the lead, but for some reason the showrunners decide her first kiss isn't all that important. But anyways, let's just focus on Jet. Ever since his introduction in, of course, the episode Jet, he is portrayed as a very masculine, very mature guy. I mean, his voice actor has a much deeper voice than Sokka's, for example. As a matter of fact, Sokka and Jet are put in a contradiction ever since the first scene they're in, and Jet actually gets in between Sokka and Katara for the brief time they spend at his hideout. This, in my eyes, is him quite literally whipping Katara away from her motherly, family-focused role and bringing her into, his sphere, his world. And his world is very much combat oriented. I mean, one of the first things that he does is compliment her on her waterbending. And being complimented like this by a very skilled warrior, as we know, Katara must have felt ecstatic. Back at home, her waterbending was looked down upon, but here, with this guy and his freedom fighters, suddenly it seems she can be appreciated for her power. And so, given all of this, it makes sense that she would fall for him and eventually apparently have a kiss with him and date him for real. Now I'd like to address my earlier comment about Katara having a romantic aversion. I genuinely think that she did, but because she ventured out with Aang to explore the world and save it, eventually, she felt the ability to jump to the other ship, I guess. She's been in the camp of I don't want to have anything to do with relationships because it's not my time and I'm busy, but maybe subconsciously, because of the newfound freedom that she has, her mind becomes more open to the idea of romance, and only naturally when Jet comes into the picture. So they're dating, and there's something specifically I want to point out. Throughout Katara's journey in the show, we get a glimpse of what her love language is like. So as we all know, she has a very tough motherly instinct, and it leads her to care for the people that she loves, sometimes a little desperately. We see her have a standoff with Toph in season 3 because of it, because of her overbearing desire to tend to people and to immerse herself in their problems. That being said, we don't actually see her do any of this with Jet. I mean, she makes Jet a hat, I think, but besides that, we don't see her tend to him, cook for him, or make his bed, pamper him the way she pampers Aang, or train him the way she trains Aang. Overall, Jet appears to be a well-rounded person if we ignore the big reveal in the end of the episode. If we ignore that, the way he seems in the eyes of Katara at that moment, he seems like a very well-rounded, mature guy, and it feels nice to be able to lean on him because she hasn't really been able to lean on anybody besides her gran and occasionally Sokka. Not to mention that Jet actually seems quite willing to be I suppose the knight in shining armor in Katara's life. I mean, the first thing he does is actually save her and her friends, but he is willing to play that role without actually taking away her own combat agency. All of this is to say that initially Jet seems like the perfect blend of traits that Katara is looking for in a partner. And the cherry on top is that they have the shared trauma of losing a parent, or in Jet's case, both parents, to the Fire Nation. Now, Jet's desire for revenge is like a topic in and of itself, so I'm not gonna focus on it that much, but I am gonna say that Katara and Jet, unbeknownst to her, went into very different directions from the point of which they lost their parents. Katara fell into this day-to-day of suppressing her anger and eventually, trampling it down to a little charcoal in the back of her soul, whereas Jet went into the more expressive kind of effort where he's literally fighting Fire Nation every day. So Katara suppressed while Jet expressed, but there is a very big similarity between them. They both go into caregiving roles. Katara was the right hand of her village elder, you could say, and Jet became the leader of a group of kids, a literal gang. So they both took on leading roles kind of naturally. The episode Jet actually focuses on leadership quite a lot, and it begins with a conversation between Aang, Katara and Sokka about who's the leader of their own gang. Sokka claims he is the leader and Katara claims Aang is the leader. Although, you can disagree with this, but it's actually Katara who is the glue and the heart and the soul of the group. Even though she doesn't direct their every move, she has a lot of influence over every single one of them. And in the same episode, when Sokka is fed up with Jet's shenanigans and wants to leave, Katara says, "No, we're staying." And this is what ends up happening. Aang agrees with her passively. So Jet and Katara's similar kind of loss leaves them into similar positions in their social circles. All of this is to say, Katara and Jet resemble each other a lot, and they have good chemistry, which comes at the expense of her motherly role and Sokka's standing in her life. However, the problem arrives shortly, and it is of course Jet's fixation on revenge. He is willing to commit mass murder of civilians who actually did nothing bad to him, they just happened to be related to the people that did him wrong. And most importantly, he was willing to use Katara's power and her kindness and her friendship and her infatuation with him for it, without telling her. This is where I'd like to point out that I don't think Jet loves Katara or he ever loved her genuinely. If he did love her, he wouldn't have used her and he wouldn't have lied to her, and he wouldn't have put himself between her and her family. And when it becomes impossible to hide who he really is, Jet confronts Katara and Aang and uncovers the real meaning behind his revenge. This betrayal whips Katara back to reality. I mean, you can see how she snaps back to her usual self, and she is immediately concerned about Sokka, because at that point Sokka is missing and Jet has lied to her about his whereabouts. What I'm implying here is that Jet had Katara under a kind of spell, and I absolutely believe that. I think she had a crush on him, maybe she really was in love, maybe it didn't have time to grow into love, but nevertheless her feelings towards Jet clouded her judgment, and this is actually one of the very few times in the show where Katara's instinct betrays her. So you can imagine the psychological toll that this incident had on her, especially given that she is a very instinctual person. Her and Sokka have a conversation about instincts and she kinda mocks his instincts, but at the end of the day they are proven to be accurate, and throughout the series Katara proves that when she makes choices they are very much influenced by her emotional state, arguably more so than her rational thinking. So we can only imagine how terribly she felt when her own feelings pushed her in the wrong direction. And I definitely believe that this incident made her a little more wary when it came to romance in the future. Now the next moment I want to focus on is the episode The Fortuneteller, where Katara asks Aunt Wu about her love line and subsequently Aunt Wu tells her a bunch of things. So firstly, the fact that Katara is actually willing to talk about love at that point showcases, I think, what I was talking about earlier about her mind being more open to this topic. Famously, Aunt Wu tells her that she's gonna marry a powerful bender, although also famously that doesn't narrow it down one bit. I mean, Ozai is a very powerful bender. Katara's whole demeanor throughout the episode shows that she has been able to put Jet in the past, at least on the surface level. She doesn't seem downcast at all when it comes to imagining her future husband, and there is absolutely no implication that she remembers Jet at all. So I guess her feelings for him weren't the kind of deep love that some people might attribute, and it was actually a superficial crush that was fueled by very strong emotions related to their shared trauma. Even more importantly, I think Katara doesn't seem to think about Aang at all as a potential love partner up until the end of the episode when Sokka just happens to say that Aang is a very powerful bender. What's also interesting is Katara's whole reaction to this. The camera spins around her and she appears very shocked, and I actually think this is the beginning of kataang, at least in Katara's mind. And now comes the point of the video where I have to say I am not a kataang shipper, and I have very strong reasons as to why. The main reason is, as I'm going to explain now, pretty much every single kataang moment from season 1 through season 3 receives basically no reflection in the following episodes. When two characters are in a relationship, we expect this relationship to change as they go through certain things together. For example, as in the Fortuneteller episode, Katara suddenly realizes Aang could be her husband in the future. However, in the next episode, there doesn't seem to be any indication that this idea has changed her. I'm not going to focus on kataang specifically, but keep in mind I am biased against it, because of the enormous amount of thinking I've done on Katara's point of view. The next point of season 1 I'd like to focus on is the episode The Waterbending Master, because it actually gives us a lot more insight into the culture of the water tribes. More specifically, because of Yue, it gives us insight into the marriage customs. We learn that at least in the Northern Water Tribe, 16 is considered to be a marrying age, because Yue is 16 and she's about to marry Han. As a nice little side note, I'd like to point out that Sokka is 15 during the original show, so it actually makes a lot of sense that he'd be interested in women and he'd have a bunch of relationships, because 15 actually falls pretty nicely before the marrying age of 16. Anyhow, so Katara is 14, and what does that mean? I think it means that, at least culturally, Katara is considered a maiden, which means a young unmarried girl. So if you recall in the first episode when Aang tells her that she is still a child, I don't want to say that she is not. I mean, definitely when it comes to our standards of childhood, Katara is a child, kind of maybe going into teenagehood, simply looking at her age. But I think when it comes to her culture, or at least if we are to take the Northern Water Tribe's culture as Water Tribe in general, she isn't really that much of a child anymore. She's kind of growing into adulthood very rapidly. As a matter of fact, she is only a couple of years away from marriage. By the way, the fact that Katara and Sokka don't seem fazed or surprised at all that Yue would be getting married at 16, and the fact that Sokka tries to romance Yue and succeeds and they actually share a kiss, showcases that their culture also considers 16 a marrying age. That's just a couple of arguments for you. But this is all I have for you for now. If you wanna see me cover seasons 2 and 3, you better leave a comment, like, subscribe, and goodbye.